The snow had been falling for 6 hours when the wolves found her first. They came out of the tree line in a loose, patient line, 3 of them, their gray shapes dissolving and reappearing between the curtains of white. They were not running. Wolves that run are chasing something that might escape. These moved the way a man moves when he has already decided the outcome, slow and deliberate, stopping only to lower their heads and read the smell of blood on the wind. The blood was coming from a woman lying face down in the drift at the base of a split pine. She was wearing a dress the color of wet ash and a coat 2 sizes too large, the kind of coat a woman grabs when she is not packing, when she is only running. One boot had come off somewhere back along the trail. Her bare foot had gone the blue-gray of a winter sky before dawn. She was not moving. She might have been a piece of freight that fell off a wagon and was left where it landed, except that freight does not leave a red stain spreading outward through the white. Colt Decker saw the wolves before he saw her. He was moving down off the ridge on his trapline route, his snowshoes punching a steady rhythm into the crust, his breath coming in short white bursts that the wind took and shredded. He had been up since before first light, the kind of morning where the cold gets inside the seams of a man's coat and stays there no matter what he does about it. His beard had gone stiff with ice along the lower jaw. He was thinking about nothing except the next trap set and the firewood he needed to split before dark, and then he saw the 3 shapes in the tree line and every other thought left him. He stopped. He read the wolves the same way they were reading the scene below, standing still, head lowered, cataloging. The way the nearest one held its weight back on its haunches. The direction all 3 were looking. Then he saw the gray coat at the base of the pine, then the bare foot. He pulled the rifle from his back in one motion and fired into the air. The wolves scattered into the pines without a sound, the way smoke scatters, as if they had never been there at all. He was already moving down the slope before the echo of the shot finished rolling across the ridge. Before we go any further, if you are new here, please take a second and hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. Leave a comment and tell me what city or state you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. She was breathing. He found that out first, pressing 2 fingers to the side of her throat before he even thought about anything else. The pulse was there, thin and fast, the kind of pulse that is working very hard to maintain its claim on being a pulse at all. He turned her over carefully, and the snow that had built up on her coat fell away in slabs. She was younger than the gray coat had suggested, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair matted against one cheek and a cut above her left eyebrow that had bled freely and then begun to seal in the cold. Her lips had gone the color of old ash, and the skin along her cheekbones was waxy in the way that scared him more than the blood did, because blood you can stop, but cold does not negotiate. He did not know her name. He did not know how she had come to be here, on his trapline ridge, in a storm that had no business letting anyone walk through it. He knew only what he could read from the evidence she had left behind, a trail of uneven footprints filling fast with snow, no horse tracks alongside them, no pack dropped nearby, nothing but the coat and the dress and the single boot still on her right foot, and the fact that she had been moving away from the direction of Rimstone Creek rather than toward it. Running from something. He noted that and filed it away because it was a problem for later. The problem right now was 20 miles of mountain between this split pine and his cabin. He looked at her foot. He pressed his bare palm against the sole of it, and the cold of her skin went through his hand like a blade. He stood up and looked at the ridge above him. The storm had come in from the northwest and showed no intention of reconsidering. The light was already failing, going flat and gray, in the way it does in high country winter, an hour before full dark. He shrugged off his pack. Colt Decker was not a man who had ever been called sentimental. The men he had scouted with in the territory before he came up into the high country would have found the word funny applied to him. He was built on the lean side of big, with hands that had been broken and reset enough times that the knuckles had a permanent topography to them, and a face that had been weathered past the point where expressions came easily or often. He had lived alone on this ridge for 3 winters, and he had chosen that. He had chosen it after Remy died in the canyon outside Fort Harker, because Colt had stood still for one moment too long, trying to think instead of act. And that moment, that single frozen half-second of hesitation, had been all the raider needed. Everything after that had been consequence. He did not stand still now. He took out the wool blanket from the bottom of his pack, the one he had told himself 100 times he ought to leave behind on account of the weight. He wrapped her feet first, then her hands, working quickly and without wasted motion. He fashioned a carry from his pack straps, a rough thing, improvised, the kind of construction you build when there's no time to build it right. He checked the tension twice, and then he got his arms under her and lifted. Her weight settled against his back, and he felt it from the shoulders down to the ankles, and he stood there for a moment in the howling white and took one long breath. He smelled the pine and the cold and the iron of her blood, faint but present, carried on the same wind that was now pushing against his chest like something alive trying to stop him. He started walking. The first quarter-mile was the worst because the body had not yet arrived at its arrangement with the task. His muscles were still expecting to be done for the day. They had been on the trapline since before dawn, and they knew what time it was, and they had opinions about what was being asked of them now. He did not argue with the opinions. He acknowledged them and kept walking. The cold was a specific kind of cold, the kind that comes when the wind has been blowing long enough that it has had time to refine itself, to shed everything that is not pure cutting edge. It found his ears first and then the back of his neck, and then it worked methodically down the collar seam while he moved through the tree line and out the other side and up onto the exposed ridge face where the wind had nothing between it and him. He adjusted his grip on the carry straps and checked her weight and kept going. 20 miles in a blizzard with a woman on your back is not a thing you do by thinking about it whole. You do it the way you do anything that seems impossible, by refusing to look at the total of it. You look at the next 10 steps, then the 10 after that. You find that you are in the 4th mile without having consciously finished the second, and that becomes the method. The wind came in sideways off the northern face of the ridge, the kind of wind that does not gust but simply presses, constant and purposeful, carrying ice crystals that found the gap between his collar and his jaw and stayed there. The snowshoes were meant for one man's weight on dry powder, not one man and 120 pounds of woman on wind-packed crust, and twice in the first mile he punched through up to his knee and had to haul himself free with one arm while keeping the other locked behind her legs. He did not stop. Stopping in a blizzard at this altitude was the same as lying down and letting the mountain make its final decision about you. He talked to her while he walked, which was not something he had done with any living person in more months than he could reliably count. He had not entirely meant to start. The first words came out somewhere in the 2nd mile, when his lungs were beginning to formally object to this arrangement, and his mind needed something to occupy it besides the burning in his shoulders and the arithmetic of how many miles remained. He told her about the ridge, how in summer the whole north face turned purple with lupin, so thick you could wade through it like shallow water, the smell of it coming up warm and clean in the afternoon heat. He told her about the elk that came down to the creek below his cabin every morning in October, the big bull with the broken tine on his right antler, the one Colt had watched for 3 falls running and had never once thought about shooting. He told her about the way the aspens turned in September, a yellow so deep and saturated that the word golden was barely sufficient, but was the only one the language offered. He told her about the creek sound in spring when the snowmelt came down off the high country and the water went white and loud and ran over the rocks with a sound like 10 conversations happening at once. He did not know if she could hear him. He had some small faith that she could, on account of the way the body holds on when it has something to hold on to, even something as thin as a voice in the dark. He talked anyway, because she needed to know there was a world on the other side of this cold, and because the sound of his own voice in the wind kept the silence from becoming the other kind, the kind that closes in. The miles went the way miles go in that country, not in a straight line, but in a negotiation. The trail drifted east twice and had to be relocated by feel, by the angle of the wind against his left cheek and the way the pines stood in relation to the ridge behind him. He descended into a draw he had not meant to enter and came up the other side on his hands and one knee, the free hand grabbing at exposed root while the carry arm held her weight against his back. And he did not narrate that mile because there was nothing useful to say about it. By the 7th mile, his right shoulder was beyond burning and into a quieter, more serious register of complaint. By the 10th mile, his knees had taken on a loose, uncertain quality he intended to address later when there was time for addressing things. By the 14th mile, he had stopped thinking in miles and started thinking in trees, identifying a particular pine 50 yards ahead and walking to it, and then identifying the next one. The trees became the unit. The trees were manageable. By the time the low dark shape of his cabin appeared in the white, he had covered the 20 miles in just under 7 hours. He knew because the storm had been coming full dark when he started, and it was coming full dark again when he kicked open the door and carried her inside, the last thin gray light leaving the sky to the west like a lamp being turned slowly down. He laid her on his bunk and rebuilt the fire from the coals before he did anything else. The cabin was cold enough that his breath still misted, and the kindling was damp from the cold seeping through the walls, and it took him longer than it should have to coax the flame out of what remained in the stove. He fed it in thin strips of pine, one at a time, until it caught and held, the orange light spreading across the plank floor and up the log walls where his traps hung in rows, and his spare tools leaned in the corner, and the single shelf above the stove held his coffee tin and his rolled medical kit, and 3 books he had read enough times that the covers had softened. Then he turned to her. He had accumulated skill with injuries, in the way men who live alone in the high country accumulate it, out of plain necessity over years of occasions where the nearest doctor was a day's ride and the problem needed addressing now. The cut above her eyebrow had stopped bleeding during the carry, sealed by the cold, which was the one courtesy the storm had extended. He cleaned it with water he heated over the stove and closed the edges together with small strips of soft hide pinned flat, the technique an old Crow woman had shown him after he took an arrow graze along his ribs in the year 1869. It was not a technique he had looked for an occasion to use again. He was glad he had paid attention when she showed him. The foot was the longer matter. 2 of her toes on the bare foot had gone hard and white, and felt when he pressed them with care the way something feels when the life has temporarily evacuated and has not yet decided whether to return. He sat down with his back to the growing fire and took her foot in both hands and held it against his chest, inside his open coat, against the warmth of his body. Not heat. Heat was the wrong treatment. Frostbitten tissue needed to be coaxed back rather than startled, needed to remember warmth gradually, the way trust is rebuilt rather than demanded. He sat like that for a long time, her foot held between his palms, the fire building behind him, the storm outside pressing at the walls with its old patient force. She woke somewhere in that hour. Not all the way. She surfaced from wherever she had been the way a person surfaces from very deep water, slowly and with enormous effort, her eyelids moving before her eyes opened, her breathing changing its pattern first. He felt the change in her foot before he saw it in her face, a small, involuntary tightening in the muscles, the body reasserting its preferences about where it was and what was happening to it. He kept his voice level when he spoke, the same tone he used with horses that had been ridden badly, calm and without demand. "There is food when you are ready." He kept his voice even, the same tone he used with horses that had been ridden badly. "You are safe here. Nobody comes up this mountain in a storm like this one." Her eyes opened. They were a dark amber color, the color of creek water over sandstone in the late afternoon sun, and they moved around the cabin with the quick, assessing sweep of a person who has learned not to trust the first comfortable thing they encounter. They took in the walls, the fire, the traps on their pegs, the single window with its oiled cloth cover rattling in the wind. They landed on him and held there, and he watched them move from his face to his hands and back up again, and then to the door behind him, measuring. He understood that look. He had seen it on horses that had been ridden into the ground. He moved back and gave her room. "The door's not locked," he nodded toward it. "You can use it when the storm breaks. Until then, the mountain will finish what it started within an hour of you stepping out. That is not a threat. That is the truth about altitude in winter." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she closed her eyes. She did not try to rise. That was the first night. He did not sleep much. He fed the fire through the dark hours and listened to the storm work on the cabin, and every hour or so he got up and checked her breathing and the color in her fingers and the temperature of her foot, and by the time the gray light started coming in under the oilcloth window, the foot was warm and the fingers had their color back and her breathing had evened into something regular and deep. He made coffee and sat at the table and watched the light change. Her name was Wren Aldis. She gave him that on the second day when she was sitting up against the cabin wall with a tin cup of broth warming her palms and enough color back in her face that he had stopped the hourly counting of her breaths. She said her name the way a person extends the minimum required, a door cracked 1 inch to show that there is a room beyond it without committing to any kind of entry. He did not push it. He told her his name in return, and she looked at him over the rim of the cup and said that Colt was a name for a horse. He allowed that it was, and that appeared to satisfy both of them for the rest of the day. He was not accustomed to another person in the cabin. The adjustment was not, he found, entirely uncomfortable, which surprised him. She moved through the small space with care, and without taking up more of it than she needed, and she understood without being told where things were and what they were for, in the way a person understands an environment when they have spent a long time having to learn environments quickly, because environments were not always safe. On the second afternoon, she mended the leather hinge on his storage chest, which had been pulling loose from the wood since the previous autumn. He had been meaning to fix it. She did it without mentioning it, finding the awl and the spare leather in the same corner where he kept them, working with the focused patience of someone who has repaired things all her life and has not been in the habit of waiting for someone else to notice that they need repairing. He watched her work from across the room and thought that competence was a thing that showed in the hands more than anywhere else. What a person's hands did when they were not being watched told you more about them than anything they said. She looked up and found him watching, and he looked away at the window. Outside, the wind was still moving, but the snow had tapered to a fine, dry sift, more habit than storm at this point, the system running out of what it needed to stay itself. On the morning of the third day, the storm broke. It ended the way some hard things end, not in a dramatic cessation, but in a gradual thinning, the roar dropping to a moan, dropping to a sigh, and then a silence that had a different quality than the silence before the storm, heavier and more settled, like something that had said its piece and gone. Colt went outside at first light and stood on the step, and the world was a brilliant, blinding white, every surface given a fresh coat, every pine bent low under its burden. The air was still and sharp and cold enough that breathing it felt like drinking something. He stood on the step and looked out at the ridge and thought about what was below it. Jesper came up that afternoon on his mule. He materialized out of the white in the way Jesper had of materializing, without apparent hurry and without apparent surprise at anything he encountered, the old sutler who made the climb to Colt's cabin twice a season with supplies. He had been supplying Colt's cabin for 2 winters, and had long since reached an accommodation with the mountain that involved not being startled by what it produced. He tied the mule to the post outside, came in, set down his pack of cornmeal and salt pork and 2 pounds of coffee, accepted a cup, looked at Wren by the fire with an expression of mild and uncomplicated acknowledgement, and drank his coffee. He told them, in the same tone he used to report weather and grain prices, that Rimstone Creek was talking about a woman gone missing from the Aldous homestead 4 days prior. Her father had reported it to the marshal. He had said his daughter had walked off in a mood and not come back. The silence that followed in the cabin had a particular texture to it, like the silence in a room after a word has been said that cannot be taken back. Wren was looking at the fire. Her hands had tightened around the cup. Everything else about her was still, but it was the stillness of controlled rather than natural quiet. She looked at the fire and said, flat and without inflection, that her father had called it that calling it that was how he made a thing sound like something it was not. Jesper finished his coffee. He put his cup down and buttoned his coat and stood up and picked up his pack without asking a single question. At the door he stopped and looked back at Colt, briefly and directly, with an expression that said he recognized a complicated situation when he was standing in the middle of one and was glad it was Colt's to navigate rather than his own. Then the door closed, and the sound of the mule on the snow trail faded south. Colt waited until the sound was gone entirely. He stood at the window for a moment and watched the trail. The afternoon light was flat and white and cast no shadows, the kind of light that makes distance hard to read. He watched until he was sure the trail was empty, and then he went to the stove and refilled both cups. She had not moved. She was sitting very still in the way she had when a thing was being processed rather than felt, when the feeling was being set aside for later because the present required something other than feeling. He had learned to recognize this quality in her. It was not coldness. It was the opposite of coldness. It was what a person who feels things deeply does with those feelings when the situation demands clarity instead. He set her cup on the table in front of her and sat down. He went to the window and looked out at the trail for a moment, and then he turned back into the room. He sat down across the table from her. "You do not have to tell me anything you are not ready to tell." He sat down across from her at the table and kept his hands flat on the wood. "But I need to know if someone is going to come looking up this mountain. Because if they are, I need to know that before they arrive." She was quiet. The fire burned, and the thin draft came in under the door and moved along the floor, and the cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine and the salt pork that had been simmering since morning. She looked at the table for a long time, at the grain of the wood, and then she looked up. She looked at the fire rather than at him. "His name is Harlan Voss." She said it in the measured, precise way of someone who has rehearsed the telling in their own mind many times, who has gone over it in the dark and in the early morning and has smoothed every raw edge of it down into something that can be stated without breaking. "Voss works for a man named Callum," she continued. "Callum has a business in Laramie. My father owed Callum a great deal of money, borrowed over several years against the land and never repaid because my father has always been better at finding reasons why repayment must wait than at actually repaying. When there was nothing else to borrow against, Callum sent Voss out to collect the debt a different way. My father signed a paper saying I was to go with Voss to work in Callum's establishment until the debt was considered settled." She said all of it plainly, with the flatness of someone who has already done the full weight of feeling about a thing and is now simply reporting it as fact. Colt had been enough places and seen enough of the frontier to understand with complete clarity what kind of establishment in Laramie serviced debts through the labor of young women. He looked at her. "When were you supposed to go?" "Voss came to collect me 4 days before the storm." She kept her eyes on the table. "I ran the same night he came. So he's been looking for 4 days. He has not stopped looking." She looked at the table again. "The debt is large, and Callum does not absorb large losses, and Voss does not fail. He is not the kind of man who fails at something and then moves on to other things. He is the kind who stays." Colt sat with that for a moment. He looked at her steadily. "He has had 4 days to ask questions in Rimstone Creek. Jesper is careful. But other people in that town know there is a trapper's cabin on the North Ridge, and some of them talk more than Jesper does." She looked up at him then. She looked up at him. "How long before he comes up?" "When the trail is passable," Colt told her. 2 days, maybe less if he has a good horse and a local guide." She nodded, a single small controlled movement, the movement of someone who is not surprised and was not expecting good news, but still has to absorb a thing before she can proceed. Then she looked at him directly and said that she was not going back. She said it without heat or any plea in it, the way you say something that is simply a fact that the other person in the room needs to have so they can make their decisions accordingly. He held her gaze. "I did not carry you 20 miles to hand you to someone else." He said it evenly and without hesitation. Something shifted in her face, not much. A small change, the way a landscape changes when a cloud moves and the light falls differently, the same features suddenly carrying a different depth. What he did not say, not that night, was that the decision had been made earlier than that conversation, earlier even than the cabin, earlier than the long dark miles of the carry. It had been made at the base of the split pine with his fingers at her throat, and the wolves still moving somewhere in the pines behind him. It had been made in the body before the mind caught up, the way most real decisions are made, the way the most important ones always seem to be. He had not put her down. He was not entirely sure, in the honest part of his thinking, that the choice had been purely practical. He had told himself it was practical. He had told himself that going for help in that storm meant she was dead before help came. Both of those things were true. They were not the only things that were true. He spent the following day preparing. He checked his ammunition and found it adequate for what was likely to come. He reinforced the cabin door with an additional pine bar, fitting it into brackets he cut from scrap leather in the afternoon. He walked the perimeter of the property twice in the early morning when the light was still thin and gray and the snow carried sound well, and he identified the three approaches a man on horseback would logically use, and the one he himself would choose if he were coming up this mountain with bad intentions. He noted the distance from the east tree line to the cabin door. He noted how many seconds a man on horseback needed to cross that open ground. Wren came out on the second walk around without being asked. She came in the spare coat that fell past her knees with her hair tied back, and she fell into step beside him and looked at what he looked at and did not ask questions but made observations instead. At the east side, she stopped and looked at where the trees thinned and the ground opened up. She addressed the tree line rather than him. They will come from here. The cover is thinner and the ground is level. A man on horseback can reach the door faster from this side than from any other direction. He looked at the east approach and then he looked at her. She turned and met his eyes. She turned and met his eyes. I have spent 2 years thinking about what men like Voss do and where they come from. You learn to think about it when thinking about it is the only plan you have. He nodded slowly. He recognized that kind of thinking. It was the same kind he had done in the year after Fort Harker, in the long winter before he found his way up to this ridge. The cataloging of threats and exits and distances, the way your mind becomes a survey instrument when survival is what you are surveying for. He told her what he was going to need from her when the time came. She listened. She asked 2 questions, both of them practical. Then she nodded and went back inside. They came on the morning of the 5th day after the storm. Colt heard them before he could see them. The sound of a horse's moving through snow carries differently in cold air than most people expect, muffled but present. The hoof strikes transmitted through the frozen ground and up through the soles of a man's boots if he stands still and pays attention. He was at the window when he heard it, and he stayed there, watching the east tree line until the shapes came through. 3 riders, moving carefully, not rushing, because men who rush in deep snow have made a poor calculation, and Voss did not look like the kind of man who made poor calculations about logistics. He came up slowly and correctly, the 2 men he had brought spreading to either side naturally, without any apparent signal, the way men spread out when they have done this kind of work before, and know the choreography without needing to discuss it. Colt went to the back room. He went to the back room door and kept his voice low and level. 3 men from the east, exactly as she had read it. Stay here, stay low. Do not come out for any sound except my voice telling you it is done. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the far wall, her knees drawn up, and the hunting knife he had given her 2 days prior resting flat against her knee with her hand around the handle. Her face was composed. Her breathing was slow and deliberate, the breathing of someone who has made their peace with a hard situation and is now simply present inside it. I am not hiding. She met his eyes, and her voice was quiet and certain. I am waiting for the right moment. That is not the same thing. He looked at her for 1 second. Then he went out the front. He went out before they reached the cabin, which was the first and most important thing. A man who comes out to meet you has already decided that the ground belongs to him. That message arrives before a single word is spoken, and it is impossible to unsay. He stood on the step with his rifle at his side, barrel down, and waited. Voss was the lead rider. Colt read him at 20 yards before the man opened his mouth, broad through the shoulders, carrying weight the way a man carries it when he has put it on through appetite rather than work, with a flat, wide face and pale eyes set close together above a nose that had been broken at least once and reset badly, slightly to the left of center. He wore a buffalo coat that had been expensive once and now showed the wear of many seasons' use, the kind of man who had spent a long time collecting things that other people considered theirs and had never personally encountered a compelling reason to question whether that was a right and reasonable occupation. He pulled his horse up at 10 yards. Looking for a woman, Voss said. Goes by Wren Aldis. Her father signed a legal paper. I am here to recover her on behalf of the creditor. His voice had the flat, recited certainty of a man who had delivered this particular speech many times and had not previously found it insufficient. Colt looked at him. No woman up here, Colt told him evenly. Nobody on this mountain but me and the elk." Voss's mouth moved in the shape of something that might have been a smile. "Mind if we come in and look around?" Voss said. Colt kept his eyes on Voss's right hand. "I do mind," Colt replied. "This is my property. You do not have a badge and you do not have a warrant, which means you have no legal standing on this land. I would like you to ride back down." Voss reached his right hand toward the inside of the buffalo coat. Colt's rifle came up in the same motion, not aimed at Voss but at the man on the left flank, who Colt had identified in the first 10 seconds of their arrival as the more dangerous of the two. He held his horse with his knees alone, keeping both hands loose and ready. He had the eyes of a man who had been paid to be fast before. "You will not clear leather before I put this round through your man," Colt said. "I am not saying that for the sake of hearing myself talk. I am saying it because it is the accurate description of what will happen." The hand inside the buffalo coat went still. The 3 horses stood in the cold and breathed. The steam from their nostrils rose and was taken by the wind. The pines behind the cabin made their long, continuous sound. "There is a legal paper," Voss said again, and his voice had shifted into a different register now, the certainty still present, but with something under it that was calculating rather than settled. "There is a woman who walked through a killing blizzard with one bare foot rather than honor it," Colt replied. "I know enough law to know that a man cannot sign a legal paper selling his own child into servitude and have it hold before a judge in any territory. You are welcome to take that paper to Cheyenne and get an official opinion on it." Voss looked at him with the pale eyes. He was doing his reading, measuring the stillness of the rifle and the face of the man behind it, and arriving at his assessment of what those things would cost. "A legal matter does not go away because a man with a rifle says so," Voss said. "No," Colt agreed, "but you still need to be alive and uncomplicated to pursue it." The wind moved through the pines and the horses shifted, and the cold pressed down on everything equally. Then the cabin door opened. He heard it behind him, the hinge and the step on the boards, and he felt his jaw set because he had told her to stay back. At the same time, a quieter part of his mind noted that she had told him exactly what she was doing, and she had used the words waiting for the right moment, and he had heard those words and not fully understood them until now. She came and stood beside him on the step. She was wearing the borrowed coat and her hair was down, and she had the hunting knife at her side, held the same way he held the rifle, present and ready but not yet raised. She looked up at Voss with the amber eyes, direct and steady, and Voss looked back at her, and for a moment the yard was very quiet. "I am Wren Aldous." Her voice was clear and carried no waver in it. "My father signed a paper he had no legal or moral authority to sign, and I do not consider it binding. If Callum wants to dispute that claim, he may take it before a judge in Cheyenne, and I will appear before that judge and tell him in complete detail what kind of establishment Callum operates in Laramie and what work he intended me to perform there." She said it without a waver. She said it the way you say something you have had a long time to prepare, something you have turned over in the dark on 100 different nights and shaped until it was exactly right. And you are now delivering it at the moment you calculated it would do the most work. Voss looked at her. Something moved through the pale eyes. Not the reading he had been doing a moment ago, which was arithmetic. This was something different, a recalculation, a sudden awareness that the variables had changed. He was afraid of the rifle. He understood rifles. But what she had just said to him was something else entirely, because it pointed toward a judge in a courtroom and a public account of Callum's business, and Callum's business depended above all other things on not being publicly accounted. His jaw moved once. He looked back at Colt, and at the rifle, and at the man on his left who was still held inside the barrel's attention, and then he looked at the mountain rising behind the cabin and the sky above it, the pale, hard blue of a winter morning in the high country. He turned his horse. He did not say anything further. There was nothing to say that did not concede the situation, and so he said nothing at all. His 2 men turned with him, and the 3 of them rode back across the open ground and into the east tree line, and Colt watched them until the last shape had been swallowed by the pines, and the sound of their horses had faded to nothing. He lowered the rifle. The cold that came back in around him was the cold that had been there all along, the cold he had not been feeling while the 3 horses stood in the yard. He exhaled once, long and controlled, and turned. She was still standing on the step beside him. The knife was still at her side. Her face was returning from whatever place a person's face goes when they have been holding themselves in a very particular stillness inside a dangerous situation, the color coming back into her cheeks in the cold air, her breath coming more freely. "I told you to stay in the back." He turned and looked at her. She looked up at him. "I told you I was waiting for the right moment." She kept her eyes on his face. "You were in a standoff, and none of them were moving. I know what Callum's name does to men like Voss when it is attached to a judge in a courtroom. I know that he is more afraid of public exposure than he is of any single rifle, because the rifle only removes him once, and a judge could end the entire operation. I was the one who knew that, so I was the one who needed to say it." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The wind came through the gap between them and lifted a strand of dark hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand and kept her chin at the angle it went to when she was stating a fact that was not available for debate. "You're going to be difficult," he said it to the cold air between them. "I have always been difficult." She said it plainly, without apology. "It is how I'm still here." He turned that over. He thought about the morning she had walked the perimeter with him and read the east approach before he had arrived at the same reading himself. He thought about her hand on the knife handle, steady, the kind of steady that is not the absence of fear, but the management of it, which was the only kind of steady that meant anything. He thought about what she had said on the step to Voss, the precision of it, the way she had known exactly which word, Callum's name, attached to which concept, a judge in a public accounting, would do more work than any rifle. She had been planning that speech for 2 years. She had been carrying it the way he had carried her up the mountain, one step at a time through the dark, waiting for the moment when it could be set down. He could not argue with it because it was accurate in every direction. She had walked through a killing storm with one bare foot and had not stopped. She had lain at the base of a split pine with wolves closing in and had held on. She had spent 2 years in that homestead mapping the thinking of men like Voss so that when the moment came, she would know the exact words that would end it. And she had known, precisely and correctly, that this morning on this step was the moment to use them. He thought about the split pine, the wolves coming through the tree line in their patient line, the moment when he had seen the coat and then the foot, and the decision had already been made somewhere below the level of reasoning, in the same place where the body decides to breathe and the heart decides to beat. He had carried her 20 miles because some part of him that did not have a precise name had refused to do anything else. He had lived alone on this ridge for 3 winters, and he had called that a choice. He understood now, standing here with the cold around him and the rifle at his side and this woman on the step beside him, that there is a difference between a thing you choose and a thing you settle for when choosing has started to feel like more trouble than it is worth. He had chosen Remy's death as a reason to settle. He had dressed the settling up as choosing and had not looked too closely at the difference. "Come inside." He nodded toward the door. "The coffee is cold." She looked at him for a moment, reading something in his face that he had not said aloud. The amber eyes had a quality he had been watching develop over these days in the cabin, a quality he recognized as the gradual return of something that had been suppressed for a long time. She looked at him and she nodded, a small nod that was not entirely about the coffee. She went inside. He followed. The door closed against the cold. That afternoon, he split firewood while the light lasted. He had told her they would run short, and he had meant it, and splitting wood was also a thing to do with his hands while his mind worked through the problem of Voss and what came after Voss. What came after Voss was Callum. Callum was a larger problem, a problem with money behind it and lawyers available to it, and the question of how a woman made herself safe from that kind of problem in a territory where the law was still a thing that lived mainly in theory was not a simple question. She came out and split alongside him without a word. She had found the second axe on its peg inside the door, and she swung it correctly, which meant someone had taught her, and she worked with the same economy of motion she brought to everything, nothing wasted, each swing placed where it needed to go. They worked until the light failed. When they came inside, the stack beside the door had grown considerably, and neither of them said anything about it. He made supper. She cleaned the dishes after, something she had started doing on the 3rd day without discussion. These were not courtesies. They were the small negotiations of two people sharing a space, the quiet establishment of a working order. He watched her hands while she worked and thought about what it cost a person to be as contained as she was, how much practice it required, how early the practice must have started. That evening the fire was high, and the wind was making its old sound in the pines, the sound it made every night up here, regardless of what happened in the small circle of warmth below it, and she sat across the table from him with her hands spread flat on the wood and looked at them. The knuckles had healed to their normal color. The cut above her eyebrow was closing clean, the strips of hide doing what they were supposed to do. Her feet, when she had checked them that morning, had returned to full sensation in every toe. She looked up from her hands. You walked 20 miles in a blizzard with me on your back. He poured coffee into her cup and then into his own. 19 and a half? He wrapped both hands around his cup. The last stretch was downhill. She stared at him across the table. Then something broke open in her face and she laughed, a real laugh, not the small, careful sound she had made on the trapline a few days before, but something that came from somewhere much further down, from the part of a person where the things they do not let out often are kept. It filled the cabin the way the fire filled it, with warmth that pushed out against the cold walls and the dark outside and made the space larger than its dimensions. He watched her laugh and thought about the wolves. He thought about the way they had moved through the tree line with their patient, certain knowledge. He thought about the moment when he had seen the gray coat and then the bare foot, and had known, before any reasoning could take place, what he was going to do. The rifle had been in his hand, and then the shot had been in the air, and he had been moving down the slope, and none of it had required a decision in any conventional sense of the word. The body had simply done what it was going to do. He had not stood still. He had stood still once when standing still cost everything, and he had carried that with him up this mountain and into these winters. And somewhere, in the dark miles of that carry with her weight on his back and the storm trying to take them both, he had put it down. He did not know exactly which mile it had happened on. He suspected it had happened gradually, the weight lightening incrementally the way the body's own exhaustion shifts somewhere in a very long walk from pain into a different register. Not painless, but accepted, built into the motion itself. He looked at her across the fire, at the amber eyes bright with the aftermath of laughing, at the face that had been guarded when he first carried her inside, and was different now, carrying different things in it. He thought about 3 winters alone on this ridge. He thought about the lupin in summer, and the elk at the creek, and all the mornings he had stood on the step in the early light with his coffee, and watched the ridge go from gray to gold, and had thought, without examining the thought, that it would be a fine thing to have someone beside him for that. He had settled. He had called it choosing, but he had settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with its ancient indifferent sound, the same sound it had made for 1,000 years before either of them was born, and would make for 1,000 years after, the mountain doing what mountains do, uninterested in and unmoved by the small warm lives inside the small warm light below it. Inside the cabin the fire burned well and the coffee was hot, and Wren Aldis, who had run through a killing storm and stood beside a stranger on a step with a knife against 3 armed men, and had known exactly what to say, and when to say it, laughed at a man who had walked 19 and a half miles in the dark because he did not know any other way to be. And Colt Decker, who had not smiled since Fort Harker and the year after it and the 3 winters since, smiled now. It was a quiet thing, small, the kind of thing you do when you are not performing it for anyone, when it comes from somewhere too deep to manage. He thought about Remy. He did not think about Remy very often by choice, but tonight he let himself, because he understood something tonight that he had not understood before, or had understood in the wrong order. Remy would have told him to stop standing still. Not on the ridge at Fort Harker, not up here on this mountain where standing still had been dressed up as a choice. Remy had been the kind of man who went toward things, who walked forward into whatever the situation presented, and Colt had spent 3 years treating that quality as the thing that had gotten Remy killed rather than as the thing that had made him worth knowing. He looked at Wren across the fire and thought that going forward was not the same as going reckless. Going toward something because it was worth going toward was not the same as going blindly. She had taught him that, without meaning to, on the step this morning. She had gone forward exactly when it counted, and she had known precisely what she was doing, and the precision was what made it work. The fire popped and settled, and the good smell of pine smoke moved through the cabin. The split pine was 20 miles behind them and a long way below. He thought about it sometimes, not with regret the way he thought about Fort Harker, but with a different quality, something closer to gratitude, which was not an emotion he had a great deal of practice with. The split pine and the gray coat and the bare foot in the snow and the wolves moving through the white with their patient knowledge and the rifle shot that scattered them. The first 10 steps of the carry and then the 10 after that. He would think about those things for a long time. He thought he would think about them for the rest of his life, which was a strange and not entirely unwelcome thing to realize about a blizzard. The wolves were back in the pines where they belonged. The mountain stood where it had always stood, and cared nothing for what happened beneath it. And inside the cabin with its orange fire and its walls of pine and its 2 cups of hot coffee on the worn table, 2 people who had each been running from something in their own direction had come to the end of running, had set that particular weight down, and had found without the weight that they were lighter than they remembered. He had been alone on this mountain for 3 winters, because being alone meant never standing still when someone else needed him to move. That was the logic he had used, and he had believed it. He understood now that the logic had been wrong, not in its facts, but in its conclusion. Being alone did not protect anyone. Being alone was just being alone, dressed up in the language of protection, and the mountain had not questioned it, because the mountain questioned nothing. She had questioned it, not with words. With the simple fact of being here, of being the kind of person she was, of standing beside him on the step with her knife and her knowledge and her 2 years of careful thinking about exactly this moment. He did not need to be alone to protect her. He needed to be present. There was a difference. Whatever came next, they would meet it from the same step. That much had been decided, not with words, but with the simple, irreversible fact of decisions already made, already carried out, already proven in the cold and the dark of a mountain that asked hard questions and did not accept anything but the true answer. Thank you for spending time up on that ridge with Colt and Ren tonight. If this story stayed with you, it found the right person. Hit subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you when you come back.